When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be getting to the Battle of the Whispering Wood, or Catelyn X, A Game of Thrones. And a nice little bit of a kind of a cool down, right? Whereas the last chapter with Tyrion was very long, probably the longest chapter that we've done so far. This one is definitely a shorter chapter. It's only 8 pages long. We really don't get to see the actual Battle of the Whispering Wood. We kind of know what occurs, but it's not as drawn out as in terms of like Tyrion, because it's very different. In Tyrion's last chapter, he is a person that the POV is in the battle, where Catelyn is not that. Catelyn is a, onlooker, right? She's being able to kind of see what's happening or hearing what's happening, and it's kind of out of harm's way. So it's kind of a different dynamic, and I like the way that George kind of switches it up from Tyrion's to Catelyn's POV. But let us get into page 694. The chapter opens with Catelyn beneath the trees, listening to the sounds of the whispers by the men, the light clinks of armor. Holland Mullen says it should be any time now, as Holland was the captain of the guards. He had asked to protect her with another 30 men by her side to escort her to Winterfell if the fighting had gone bad. So I kind of want to set the stage a little bit, because it is one of those chapters that I think is a little bit more jarring to understand fully what's going on, because it's not a linear chapter, right? It's one of those chapters in which we're right before the Battle of the Whispering Wood's going to happen, but in this chapter, we're constantly kind of going back in time to Robb and the Blackfish setting up this plan. So I kind of want to set the stage of what's actually going on at this point, so you guys have kind of a fuller picture for maybe newer book readers or people that want to know a little bit more of what's going on in the book. So when we get to this point, at this time, Catelyn, Robb, a lot of the bannermen like the Mallisters, the Freys, the Karstarks, the Umbers, they're all kind of just set up in positions along this forest way. Basically, that's what the whole plan is. They're going to ambush them on all sides. It's a very common strategy that we saw, especially in like English history, which is kind of where I think George got a lot of this based upon that the story is based upon English history. And so what ends up occurring, and what the Starks want to happen, or Robb specifically, is all of these Lannister men led by Jaime are going to come right through this pathway, of which you have all these different forces on all sides. And so that is the plan. So at this current time of the story, Catelyn is just kind of waiting. They're waiting for the Blackfish to bring the Lannisters into this trap to then formulate their plan and execute the trap. So it's kind of this lull period where Catelyn is feeling the stress, taking everything in of the situation. Catelyn notes that she had only wanted 10 men to protect her, but Robb had wanted 30. So they had settled in the middle on 30. Neither truly happy. Again, if you're Robb, you don't want to lose your mother, right? One of the most important people. You'd rather have as many guards as possible. And Catelyn's kind of the opposite, right? Catelyn would rather have all the men possible trying to protect her son instead of protecting her, who's going to be out of the way of the battle. And so, again, you can see both sides. Catelyn notes that the Lannisters will come when they come, right? There's no use worrying about it. There's nothing we can do, right? Our future now is in the hands of the Blackfish and how well his plan is executed and how much he was able to bait in Jaime. But Catelyn even thinks kind of more of a darker side of this, as it will certainly mean the possible death of Holland, hers, or even Robb's death, which is interesting, right? Given the fact that the Stark forces are not in the majority right now, right? This surprise attack, they are heavily outnumbered, right? It's going to take great military strategy, and so it is very likely that Robb is going to lose. But for now, Catelyn was content to wait and listen. And in a lot of ways, I think this is Catelyn savoring what could be the last moments of freedom or survival for herself, right? At that time, you're kind of taking things in more, right? I think something that would speak a lot to people that are close to dying is you trying to take things in more, because you realize how precious that time is. And I think that's what Catelyn's kind of experiencing in this moment. And that kind of gets us to page 695. Catelyn had not been a stranger to waiting. Men had always made her wait, whether it was her father, Hoster Tully. Hoster used to tell her to wait for him, and so she would at River Run. She would wait for him until he arrived back from court or battle, wherever Hoster was going to, and he would ask if she had waited for him. But this was not the only time, right? You got to think about this from the idea of women in this society. Women in this society are not really supposed to be in the army. The only time, women are going to be going places some like court, right? If you're trying to get them betrothed to some other lordling or prince or whatever. And so I think a lot of women would have felt like this, right? A feeling of helplessness, hopelessness is you're waiting for your husband to come back or your son to come back. That's a lot of what Catelyn's experiencing. And it's something that's going to be playing on her mind quite a lot as she feels that helplessness in terms of, you know, what happens with Bran and Rickon up north, whether it's Robb in the west. She's going to feel very boxed in. And that's why I think it leads her to some of the decisions that she makes later on in the series. But she also notes Brandon, who had also told her that he would return to wed her, but instead it had been Ned in his absence. And even then, a fortnight after he had left for the war. Again, it just paints this idea that Catelyn's always constantly been in a situation where she's had, you know, someone very close to her going off to war. But it also paints something very interesting that I think you have to consider in terms of Ned and Catelyn's relationship. We know that, yes, it seems like a loving relationship, albeit maybe there's some toxic things in there between Catelyn and Ned. I mean, whatever. But it's something that's hard to understand if you're Ned, how awkward, and Cat, to be honest, it would have been, right? Where this woman was supposed to marry your older brother, and now she's marrying you. It just feels really weird because you know Catelyn probably had a lot of was very attracted to your older brother, and now she's supposed to marry you. It's just a very weird scenario. But Catelyn does note that at least Ned had left her with a child, which she had 9 months later, not knowing if Ned would ever see him, and she remembers how small Robb had been. Yeah, that's going to be a very scary thing for Catelyn, right? You know, you marry this guy, and then the guy you were supposed to marry before dies. Ned goes off to war. At any point, Ned could die, and you could become, again, a widow with a child that doesn't have a father. So, again, a really stressful time, and it shows how war is so detrimental to families, ripping them apart and things like that, because Catelyn in a lot of ways was lucky. There's a lot of other people in this world that didn't have that luck, right? Where their husbands died, or, you know, maybe those husbands came back and their village was destroyed because of the war. So there's a lot of that going on. We're going to see a lot of that going on in this story particularly. But now she waited for Robb, or Jaime Lannister, as she thinks that Robb had wagered their lives on Blackfish's advice, that Jaime was quick to anger and restless. Again, this is great advice by the Blackfish. Knowing your enemy is a very important thing to do in terms of how do you do your war. Tywin thought that he knew Robb, and he based his strategy off of that. He didn't know Robb, and so his strategy kind of failed, right? It did fail, right? It didn't happen the way he wanted it to, because he ended up going against Roose Bolton instead of Robb. That's very key to understand, because that's one of the mind games that you always have. What is the other person going to do? And the Blackfish is one of the best players of that. And it's one thing that just was not shown in the show, which I think is unfortunate. I think the Blackfish, I think the Tullys in general got kind of shafted, right? Edmure is not really shown in the best of lights in the show, and neither is really the Blackfish, and the Blackfish is really one of the biggest key minds behind Robb's campaign. So I wanted to point that out as well. But she thinks how Robb did not seem frightened, or he did not show it, at least. And again, if you're Robb, you can't be showing fear to your men, because then if your lord, the one that made this plan, isn't confident in it, what's going to make an average soldier confident in this plan? So Robb has to project that regardless of what he's feeling, and there's a lot of feelings he's going to be feeling. If you think about the way Tyrion thought about the Battle of the Green Fork in the last chapter, I guarantee you a lot of that's going through Robb's mind, where Robb is having to put on this front. The same as what kind of Tyrion had to do as well. Catelyn thinks how tall and older he seems. He was only 15, but he was near as tall as her. She silently prays to let Robb grow taller and see him grow old and hold his own sons in his arms. And yeah, I mean, I don't think any parent ever wants to see their child, you know, die at a very young age, even before them, right? I think that is one of the worst things you could experience as a parent. And yeah, I think that's, again, one of the most humanistic parts of Catelyn, the way she cares about her kids. And, you know, it's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, as we'll kind of see later on. But in going into page 696, she watched her son with his new beard and gray wind at his side. All she could see was him when he was laid in her arms. Again, back when he was a baby, seeing him when he was younger and still her baby boy. I think all mothers kind of view their children like that. But the night was warm, and she thinks, where are they? Robb had given Blackfish 300 men. Again, we're going to go back in time a little bit here so you guys don't get too confused, but we're going to go back into kind of Blackfish's plan, the buildup of this battle. She thinks, could Blackfish had been wrong in his evaluation of Jaime, but Blackfish had staked his life on it, that Jaime did not know of their approach. Their archers had shot down any birds, and any of his outriders that had spotted them had been killed. Everything rested once again on the Blackfish. If even one raven gets away, if even one outrider that they don't see gets away, the whole plan is gone, right? This whole thing is based upon secrecy. If there's no secrecy here, they're going to lose, right? And then you look at what happens on the Green Fork, and you're sitting here going, you've now lost on both fronts. This war is over. So it's very imperative that they are kept secret. Robb had asked how large his host was, and Blackfish had responded 12,000 men, but divided into 3 among the rivers. Again, that's one of the best defensible things about River Run, is to actually fully siege it. You really need to have your camps set up in 3 different areas because of the rivers. And so it actually makes a huge advantage for Robb, because instead of this 12,000 men army being all combined together, Robb can take them almost one at a time. And then it's more of an equal playing field. Plus you have the element of surprise. That is very imperative to why Robb is able to take back River Run. Blackfish knows that 2,000 to 3,000 horse will be their undoing. But with that being said, Galbert Glover kind of notes what I think everyone here is thinking. They're outnumbered 3-1, right? It's not great odds. Everything has to go perfectly. And the Blackfish agrees, but there is one thing Jaime lacks, and that is patience. Again, Jaime is a young man that has shown he doesn't have the patience. He's proved that over and over and over again throughout history, and so the Blackfish has picked up on that. But also they note that the host had grown since leaving the twins, as the Malisters had come to their assistance. Makes sense, right? The Malisters are just kind of west of the twins. It makes sense that they would naturally meet up with Robb at that point. But also they were met up by free riders, hedge knights, people seeking glory or seeking food or whatever, right? That's just normally how it goes. Think about what we were talking about with Tywin, the amount of people that come up to the Lannister camp. Same thing here with Robb. But they also had gained other remnants of Edmure's shattered host. Again, remember, Edmure was defeated outside of River Run, and so you would have just some of those stragglers there as well. But they had to come south as soon as possible to avoid detection. We've already talked about that, but you've got to think about it. They can't stay hidden forever. You know, all it takes is one person deserting your army, and bam, it gets out. You're going to eventually find out. Whether that's from the Green Fork, right? Tywin's host eventually just sending riders to Jaime to let him know they need to get there as soon as possible. But at this, Catelyn notes the time had come. Oliver Frey, his squire, had given him his shield and helm and held his horse. Where once her son had been, was replaced by a young, gallant knight. That gets us into page 697. Robb turned to her, saying that he must now be seen before his men to give them courage. That is what Ned always told him to do. Yeah, and it's this exact idea that we talk about in terms of the Battle of the Blackwater with Joffrey. See, your men seeing that you're willing to fight and give your life for this cause is going to be very uplifting to the people. That this isn't just something where this Lord, Robb Stark is sending you to die, basically. He's right there with you. Maybe he has better armor and he has more protection from, he has his own honor guard, basically, but he's still going to be fighting there, right? He's not, isolating himself, putting himself out of the battle. That's the important part, in my opinion. But Catelyn thinks, who's going to give her courage, right? She's going to be sitting on the sidelines. She's not going to be involved in combat. She's not going to be, having the adrenaline rush and time going by, extremely fast because you're just focused on fighting and surviving. Catelyn is probably in one of the most horrific positions of all, sitting back watching, or specifically hearing. She can't really see specifically what's going on in this battle, of thinking her son maybe is going to die at any time. It's a very horrifying thing to think about. But Catelyn keeps this to herself, but she notes Robb's guard forming up. When Robb had insisted on her guard, she had insisted on his, to which the bannermen agreed, and many formed up for his honor, like a few Freys, Torrhen and Eddard Karstark, Daisy Mormont, a woman that was 6 feet tall with a morning star. Again, many of the lords was not, exactly pleased with this, because, it's not natural, it's not normal in the North for women to fight. And so having a Mormont, especially, a woman in his honor guard, the Northern lords just aren't going to like that. It's very stupid, given that she's very capable of handling herself. And Catelyn notes that, right? It's not about their honor. It's about keeping Robb alive. And if Daisy Mormont can do that, of course she should be in the honor guard more, and all of that. She thinks that, will it be enough to protect him, right? Again, All these people in this honor guard are great and all, but if their forces are beaten down, it's not going to matter. But at that, she hears a bird that sends a shiver through her spine, and then hears other birds. She knew what they meant, as they were northern birds, white as the gods would. What's interesting is you could be thinking like Bloodraven could be watching this battle. Maybe he had some sort of influence on it, right? Possible. But I just thought that was very interesting that the description of the birds is specifically noted as being the color of the gods wood. Very particular in that idea. But yeah, if you're Catelyn, this is basically the final sign, right? That the battle is about to begin, that the Lannisters are almost here. These are signs to tell everyone to be ready. But Catelyn thinks they are coming, and Hal Mullen also relays this and says, "Gods be with us." Catelyn nodded with this as she listens to the stillness of the forest with the growing sound of horse, men, and armor as they grow closer. Again, it's just Catelyn taking it all in, right? She has the opposite of what Tyrion had. This is why I love this way that George did this. In the last chapter, it felt very chaotic, right? Tyrion didn't have time to think about what's going on. He's worried about surviving, all these things. He doesn't have time to think about, oh, why isn't Robb Stark here? Why are the Starks doing this type of battle strategy? Whereas here, it's the opposite. Catelyn feels like everything is kind of slowing down. Her senses are more aware. She's able to take things in more because she's not rushing to battle. She's sitting back watching all this. I really love the way George takes what we just had in a battle and flips it on its head. It's just fantastic writing. It's what makes George so fantastic. But that gets us into 698. The laughter grew louder, and then she saw him, only a glimpse. He was wearing no helm, but his armor looked even brighter in the moonlight. Again, we just see that Jaime is not taking this seriously, right? He's not taking this little raiding party even slightly seriously, not wearing a helmet, his armor shining in the moonlight. He looks the quintessential knight of your dreams, I guess, but that is going to flip very quickly. He was then gone with about 3/4 of their horse following him. Catelyn notes how Brynden had told Robb that he is not the man to stay building siege engines. He has already ridden out multiple times. In terms of Jaime, right? Jaime is not patient, right? If he sees some sort of raiding party, he's going to go fight. He wants to fight. He doesn't want to sit back and wait for this siege, which is kind of all the more interesting when you get to A Feast for Crows, but he's not that type of person. He's proven that. And so Blackfish, again, is going to use that against him. But again, going back in time when they made this plan, Robb had studied the map and pointed to the map for the raid to draw them after them. He tells Blackfish, take only a few hundred men with only Tully banners, and they will ambush them here in the forest. Again, very important to note, it has to be Tully banners. If it's Stark banners or Northern banners at all, it's going to bring up red flags. Why are there Northern men here? I thought they were going to meet Tywin. That's very important. It's a little detail that's very important that I love that Robb brings up. Again, moving back into real time, here was her son on his stallion, and then finally Mage Mormont blew her horn to start the trap. All of the Lannisters were now within, and Grey Wind gave a great howl to signal it as well. And this sound kind of goes straight through Catelyn, right? This direwolf kind of announcing the death and carnage that is to happen. It made her shiver. For an instant, she even felt bad for the Lannisters and the Westermen. She thinks this is what death sounds like. And this isn't the only horn that is heard. Again, it's to signal the attack. We see horns in response from the Malisters, the Freys, Umbers, all around throughout the forest on both sides, and the Lannisters are trapped. And that gets us into page 699, where the final horn from the northern part of the trap was blown from the Karstark men. That gets us into 699, and I also want to actually just read what we get of the battle directly from George's words and Catelyn's thoughts. The Whispering Wood let out its breath all at once, as the bowmen Robb, hidden in the branches of the trees, let fly their arrows, and the night erupted with the screams of men and horses. All around her, the riders raised their lances, and the dirt and leaves that had buried the cruel bright points fell away to reveal the gleam of sharpened steel. Winterfell, she heard Robb shout at the arrow's side again. He moved away from her at a trot, leading his men downhill. Catelyn sat on her horse, unmoving, with Hal Mullen and her guard around her, and she waited as she had waited before for Brandon and Ned and her father. She was high on the ridge, and the trees hid most of what was going on beneath her. A heart beat 2, 4, and suddenly it was as if she and her protectors were alone in the wood. The rest were melted away in the green. Yet when she looked across the valley to the far ridge, she saw the great John's riders emerge from the darkness beneath the trees. They were in a long line, an endless line, and as they burst from the wood, there was an instant, the smallest part of a heartbeat, where all Catelyn saw was the moonlight on the points of their lances, as if 1,000 will-o'-wisps were coming down on the ridge, wreathed in silver flame. Then she blinked, and they were only men, rushing down to kill or die. Afterwards, she could not claim that she had seen the battle, yet she could hear it, and the valley rang with echoes, the crack of a broken lance, the clash of swords, the cries of Lannister and Winterfell and Tully, River Run and Tully. When she realized there was no more to see, she closed her eyes and listened. The battle came alive around her. She heard hoofbeats, iron boots splashing in shallow water, the woody sound of swords on oaken shields, and the scrape of steel against steel, the hiss of arrows, the thunder of drums, the terrified screaming of 1,000 horses. Men shouted curses and begged for mercy, and got it, well, or not, and lived or died. The ridges seemed to play queer tricks with sound. Once she heard Robb's voice, as clear as it had been standing at her side, calling, to me, and she heard his direwolf snarling and growling, heard the snap of those long teeth, the tearing of flesh, shrieks of fear and pain from man and horse alike. Was there only one wolf? It was hard to be certain. Little by little, the sounds dwindled and died, until at last there was only the wolf. As a red dawn broke in the east, Grey Wind began to howl again. Again, this really paints the picture of just this battle that we are not exactly involved in right now. For the audience, right? We're hearing it, right? Catelyn sees only glimpses of the battle, seeing all these forces comes down onto this Lannister force that was not expecting this huge fight, hearing the sound of death and hearing the sound of just all the horrors of war. Everything that we imagined and we saw from the last chapter in Tyrion, you can place that here. You know what's happening because George introduced how brutal these conflicts are. And all of this kind of culminates in this idea of a new element, a direwolf in battle. How scary that would be if you were an average soldier that didn't really know what was going on and you see this wolf in between you. It's a very horrible feeling. But again, it's this idea of Catelyn taking in her senses, right? Closing her eyes, listening to all of it. And soon the battle is over. And it's fairly quickly from what Catelyn kind of feels like. But at this time, Robb came back to her on a different mount. Again, just to show, Robb had been, fighting pretty hard. If he is on a new horse, that means his horse at some point died, right? But he seemed unhurt. When he got closer, she saw his shield had been hacked quite a lot, and he had blood on his gauntlet and surcoat. Catelyn notes he is hurt, but Robb seems in shock. And you got to remember, right? Think about everything Tyrion went through in his first battle, and now you put that into Robb, right? Robb is much younger, and he's sitting here, surviving a battle in which he's seen possibly his friends die, possibly the brutality of people begging for their lives, or, seeing people's intestines or whatever, whatever you can imagine in terms of a war. You apply that to Robb, who's 15. And we've seen all the struggles that he's had in terms of trying to become a leader, trying to become this figure that is what he thinks is a man, right? And Robb is just confused. He says it is not his blood, it is Torrhen's, or he doesn't really know. And that's the point, right? He's probably killed multiple people during this night. That could be the blood of any of them. It's this horrifying feeling that, yes, it was a victory, but war is not a happy thing. It's not something you're going to sit back and go, wow, that was a really cool experience. No, it was horrible. But Robb is followed by a mob of men, led by Theon and the Great Sean, and in between them, Jaime Lannister, as they threw him to the ground at her feet. Jaime had a gash on his head, but he notes he would offer her his sword, but he seems to have mislaid it. Catelyn says she does not want her sword. She wants Ned, her daughters, father, and brother, but Jaime has mislaid them as well. Again, it's this idea that Catelyn represents this idea of kind of the anti-war idea, right? She doesn't care about Jaime. She doesn't want his services, anything like that. She wants her family to be whole and sound, and that's just what she's missing right now. Catelyn notes, again, George takes a nice, interesting tone of voice here, as she notes coldly a pity. And Theon, very stupidly, again, showing how immature he is, how he doesn't take things seriously, tells Robb to kill him. which is incredibly stupid. Why would you ever kill Jaime here? The whole point of this war is to free Ned, right? They're not trying to uproot the political system, all those things. They're trying to get Ned back. How do you get Ned back? You trade Jaime for Ned. That's what you do, right? So killing Jaime is just stupid. Killing Jaime here makes it to where Sansa and also Ned are probably dead. So this is very stupid. Robb says no, taking his bloody glove off, as he is more valuable alive than dead. And he is a prisoner. Ned had taught him to never kill a prisoner of war, unless they commit a crime, of course. Again, a lot of foreshadowing here to the Karstark issue, what we will end up seeing in book 3, right? Like, it's this idea that's completely foreshadowed here. Robb does not believe in killing prisoners that are innocent of crimes, of these crimes specifically, right? Jaime hasn't committed anything at this point. And so that's a crucial point here. Jaime notes Ned as being a wise man and honorable, but Catelyn cuts him off, telling him to be put in chains, and Robb tells them to listen to her. And that gets us into page 701, the last of the chapter. Robb also tells them to put a strong guard on him, as Lord Karstark will want his head. Again, more foreshadowing for later. The Great John agrees, and he is led away to be chained and bandaged. But Catelyn doesn't understand this. Why would Lord Karstark want to kill Jaime? Robb looked into the woods, again, as if he's only almost seeing ghosts or reliving the trauma that he has just had going through this brutal war. And he kind of sees probably the people that have died. And Catelyn even notes this, that he had the same brooding face of Ned. And think about Ned, all the things he's seen, you know, seeing his sister die, you know, seeing all these people that he knew die at the Tower of Joy, or during a war, during the Battle of the Trident, the Battle of the Bells, whatever you want to think about here. That's kind of what Robb is experiencing for the first time. But Robb notes that he killed them, and Galbert Glover continues, Jaime killed both of the Lord Karstark's sons. And Robb, continuing, says that Eddard, Torrhen, and Darren Hornwood were all killed by the Kingslayer. And Glover kind of fills all the pieces together, because it's like, well, how did that happen? Did that just happen normally in the battle? No. Jaime knew the battle was lost. He gathered his men to try and attempt to slay Robb, and almost did, until he was stopped by their honor guard. And again, the point of this is to show that, like, Jaime is, one, a really great fighter. Jaime's also kind of intelligent in the terms of, like, understanding if he kills Robb, it could change the battle, right? Losing a leader is very important to the morale of a unit, and that could be crucial. So Jaime attempts it, just doesn't get there, but causes a massive issue for Robb going forward. Apparently, Jaime had mislaid his sword in Eddard's head after killing Torrhen and Darren. The whole time, Jaime was shouting for him if they had not stopped him, and Catelyn cuts him off. That instead, she would be mourning. Again, the idea is Robb is not accustomed to people dying for him. He feels as though their lives are on his hands, and all the lives of the men that have been lost, whether at the Green Fork or this battle specifically, are on his hands. It's a lot to deal with, right? But Catelyn gives him some very good advice, right? You know, give them their honors and mourn them, but not now. You still have a battle to win. They may have defeated Jaime, but the rest of his army was still surrounding Riverrun. They still needed to get the castle. Theon does not really share this distaste, right? As he notes this was a splendid battle, maybe the greatest since the Field of Fire, which is obviously just not true. There's been so many cooler battles in Westeros since this moment. But again, it's Theon being young, not taking things seriously. Very similar to Sansa in a lot of ways, of just not realizing what just happened, right? The stakes of what is going on right now. And Catelyn kind of notes that, right? Did you capture Tywin? No? Well, then this war is far from over. Now, that's not to say that they didn't do a good job in this battle, right? You don't lose a lot of men. You capture a lot of important prisoners in terms of other Lannister cousins, Jaime himself. It's a massive victory, right? It sets up you winning the battle for Riverrun and all that. But it's not the war, right? Catelyn is completely right in terms of that. But Theon says, no, they did not capture Tywin, in a bit of shame, right? Kind of being put in his place. Something that maybe will lead to later on why Theon decides to kind of betray Robb. And so Robb finishes pushing his hair back, stating that Catelyn is right, and they still have to deal with Riverrun. And that's kind of where I'll pick up in the next Catelyn chapter. But yeah, I mean, we're getting very close to the end of the book. Again, we're into the 700s. We have about 100 pages left. just to kind of give you the scope of where we are in the story. I mean, we have one more Daenerys chapter, and then we have Arya's chapter in terms of Ned's last chapter in the story. So yeah, we're getting pretty deep into it. And again, another great chapter from Catelyn. All of these later chapters in the first book are really fantastic. But again, a little bit of a shorter video for you guys. This chapter is kind of short just in general. And I'll see you guys all in the next chapter for Dany. I'm very excited because she has been one of my favorite POVs in this book. And bye, guys. Have a good one.